Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EO Talks 6. We are very pleased to welcome today the one-of-a-kind Rebecca Futo Kennedy and Jackie Murray, who will talk to us about teaching race and ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world. So before we start, a little housekeeping. I'm going to ask everyone except the speakers and myself to turn your microphone and camera off. We will proceed in the following way. So we're gonna, first I'm gonna introduce the speakers, and then Rebecca and Jackie will go through a discussion of about an hour. After that, we will open up the floor for your questions. So I'll be monitoring the chat. You can just include your questions maybe towards the end of the hour, because I anticipate that a lot of your questions will be responded to during the discussion. And so maybe wait a bit till the end of the presentation before typing them in. I'll monitor them and ask the questions to Jackie and Rebecca. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So Rebecca Futo Kennedy is an ancient historian and associate professor of classical studies, women's and gender studies, and environmental studies at Denison University. Her teaching and research focuses on histories of Greek and Roman in the Mediterranean context, immigration, especially of women, in the ancient Mediterranean, and ideas of race and ethnicity in antiquity, as well as their uses in the construction of modern race, particularly scientific racism, the Western civilization narrative, and classicizing architecture. She's the author of many things, among which Immigrant Women in Athens, published in 2014, and she's also the co-editor of Identity and the Environment in the Classical and Medieval Worlds. She's also the co-author and translator of Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, which she wrote with C.S. Roy and M.L. Goldman. She's currently working on a book for Johns Hopkins University Press on ancient identities and modern white supremacist identity politics, and has articles forthcoming on race and the metic in ancient Athens and on white supremacist tropes in ancient Greek history. She also runs a blog, I'm sure most of you know about it, Classics and the Intersections, which includes very useful links to teaching materials. So this is really right into the crux of the topic we're gonna discuss today. I invite you to visit her blog if you want more resources on all matters that deal with race and ethnicity, immigration, and modern white supremacism. As for Jackie Murray, she is Associate Professor of Classics in the Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department at the University of Kentucky. Jackie's primary research area is Hellenistic poetry, its reception of archaic Greek poetry, and its influence on Latin and Imperial Greek literature. Her secondary area is race and the classics, especially the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. Jackie has published and forthcoming several important articles on various aspects of Hellenistic poetry and race in classical literature. She's currently finishing a monograph on Apollonius's Argonautica, Destroyer of Worlds, Apollonius's Argonautica and the Poetics of Controversy, which will come out at Harvard University Press. I look very much forward to this. She's working on two other books, one on the Argonautica as a calendar poem, and the second one on racecraft in Greek and Roman epic from Homer to Virgil. She's also co-editing a commentary on book one of the Argonautica with Annette Harder, and co-authoring a mythology textbook for Thames and Upton with Joel Christensen and Serena Whitkey. And she is co-authoring a book on the racecraft and celluloid classical world with Anja Bettenworth. Finally, she's also working with Ishan Hutchinson and Sashame Eccleston on Patois Iliad, a Jamaican adaptation of Homer's epic. So wonderful projects, and we are really, Rachel, Usama, and I, extremely grateful to have you two with us today, as well as all of you who are joining us from North America and beyond. So I will stop talking because I'm here to learn as well. And I will leave the floor to Jackie and Rebecca. So the format will be a discussion. Rebecca and Jackie have identified 4 main themes that they want to discuss with us today. So the first one will be their different approaches to the broader themes of race and ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world, and how they approach these approaches, how they implement them in the classroom. Then they'll move on to definitions. Very important when we say race, ethnicity today in the ancient world. How are we defining these terms? So they're going to help us hopefully clarify things. I know they will for sure. Third, they will discuss with us the problems and challenges that they've been facing while teaching these topics in their own classroom. And lastly, they will reflect on their own racialization and how it's impacted their pedagogical practice. And by the same occasion, they also talk about issues of tokenism. So I might pop in at times to just monitor the time, but otherwise, the floor is yours.
Well, I think we should also mention that Rebecca and I are actually co-editing or co-authoring a forthcoming text.
My God, yes. I'm sorry,
so
I forgot to mention that.
Yeah. So that's another reason why why put us two together? Like one's a historian,
also why I approached
one's a literature person. What's that? Yeah. Well, because we're actually going to be doing that as well. Yeah.
This is not
Rebecca, you want to start or
yeah, sure. I'll start and that way I can also
put up the PowerPoint maybe.
Yeah, well, I'll start with so the where I'm going to start with is I'll start with by sharing the page on my blog, Classes at the Intersections, with everyone, because I want to start by letting everybody know that on that page, I have a whole bunch of syllabi, that including my own, Jackie's, a lot of other people. So this is the resource that I have put together. It includes different bibliographies, links to conferences or talks, links to some articles on why I even teach this material. And then a bunch of people have provided their syllabi to me, and so I've put them on here. And then I've also put links, and I continue to add links, though I'm not as quick as I used to because COVID life, to useful public-facing articles that have that people have written that might be relevant for your classroom. So I encourage you all to go to this page if you're sort of looking to get started. But I thought I would start from there because if you look at my own entries on the page, you see that I have approximately 6 different syllabi listed. And the reason for that is that my approach to teaching race and ethnicity in the ancient world over time has changed. And it actually changes every time I teach it, because one of the hallmarks of teaching race and ethnicity in the ancient world is to, one, constantly be evolving your pedagogy based on your own learning outside of teaching on race and ethnicity, modern critical race theory, expanding your own knowledge of the history and literature that is relevant. And also because I actually leave the first week of every course, the first 3 courses if I'm doing a 3-day class or 2-day-a-week class, to bridge us into the discussion of ancient race and ethnicity by starting from a very relevant current topic. So just to give you an idea of the different ways that I've done it, when I first started doing it, it was under the moniker of Barbarians back in 2008, because that was what the class was named. I didn't get to choose that. Jackie will probably chime in on her views on the view of that. And then I did a class on race and ethnicity, and now I've since switched the name of the class to Ancient Identities. That is reflective of my sort of approach of integrating the ideas of race, ethnicity, and other identity formation processes all together, with also interweaving it with a narrative of modern receptions. In the past, I've done things like environmental determinism theory and scientific racism. this last iteration, I focused on the narrative from Kennedy's, Ibram Kennedy's stamp from the beginning as a sort of counter narrative to the ancient, so they could see where these ideas floated to and back and forth in time. I deconstruct for them things like Western Civ narratives. We talk about what culture is, and then Jackie and I will both talk about definitions. But my general approach is to have an integrated ancient plus modern approach, where I work from the Race and Ethnicity sourcebook, which Katrine mentioned, that Sidner, Roy, and Max Goldman and I translated. It is not by any means a comprehensive gathering of texts on this topic from the ancient world. I actually have a 2-page single-spaced document of additions I want to make to a second edition. But I think that it's a good starting point. I made it because I didn't want to approach teaching this topic through having to order, like, you order Herodotus, you order Livy, you order Caesar, you order Tacitus, and you do sort of the greatest hits of sort of great books version. I wanted it to be a little bit more in the weeds, in the variety of texts that are used for this. But I think it's really important for students to have this interwoven narrative of ancient and modern and how the ancient impacts the modern. This means that for me, it's a constant learning curve. I'm always expanding my own research and my own readings of critical race theory. And so actually my definitions of race and ethnicity have changed over time, over the course of the last 12 years, and my approach has changed. But these resources are available, and you can actually get a lot of an idea about the way people approach this topic based on how they craft their syllabus. So I encourage you to go to the blog and check out everybody's different approaches. And then I'm going to yield to Jackie and let her talk about that before we move into our sort of definitions of race and ethnicity.
Okay, so I usually, right now I'm I'm affiliated with the African American Studies program. So I've got a joint appointment. So I teach one course usually per year on that I try to put together with classics, because one of my personal goals, is to increase the amount of students of color, particularly African American students that might be interested in classics, and to also position the understanding of classics as kind of integral to understanding history of race in America, particularly, and in the Caribbean as well. And so I usually I sort of, like Rebecca, I sort of change the way I've taught it. Every time I teach it, it's a different animal, as it were. And so one way of looking at it is more historical approach, which is what Rebecca's put up there. So Blacks in the Classics, Antiquity to Emancipation, where there the issue is focusing on ancient ideas about race. So is it possible to have race in the ancient world? These kinds of questions, and we'll get into that with the definitions. But and then also looking at slavery as a main sort of focal point of racism in general, whether it's ancient or modern, and then seeing how ancient ideas about slavery affected American ideas about slavery, and also issues of emancipation. So in that, I sort of start off looking at narrative, slave narratives. Seeing, as I'm more of a poetry person, literature person, I'm more interested in how the cultural constructions are produced. And so looking at different narratives, literature, and these kinds of approaches, and not so much counting beans and how many people were enslaved, etc. That's not so much my focus. It's more on how the race was created by these cultural mechanisms and legal mechanisms, etc. So that's one approach. And then most recently, I've looked at I'm trying to think of the most recent version. We were looking at Black classicism. So the approach of how Black Americans and Afro-Caribbeans look at the classics. Do they see it as related to them at all? And so that's another approach. And in the spring coming, I'm going to be doing another iteration of this Black classicisms with a sharp focus on early W.E.B. Du Bois and how his classical training and his approach to the classics sort of infused his activism against racism, etc. So that's planning for the following semester, next semester, and I'm actually doing that as a joint thing with Anya Bettenvort at Cologne University. We're going to look at anti-Blackness in America, and then anti-Blackness in Germany, and doing a comparison there to see that different manifestations of racism, even, it will help sort of understand why you can have a trans historical idea about race, if we can even just have a transcultural distinctions, like racism does not manifest itself the same in America as it does in Canada or in Germany. So we're going to be looking at that very closely in our course next semester. So yeah, so that's some ideas there. Pretty much I run the courses similar to Rebecca, and I use a lot of her resources as well. So yeah, should we move on to the next?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and share our screen. I have a PowerPoint that I use in my classes, and then I've added Jackie's material to it. So what we'll do is we'll go through and talk about the definitions that we use in class, because I think one of the most important things that you have to be able to do if you're going to be teaching race and ethnicity in the ancient world is you have to be very explicit from the get-go of your class. This is usually the day after we go over the syllabus and I sort of introduce issues, is that we actually go through what is race and what is ethnicity and how are we using those terms in our classroom environment, because as many of you know, there's a vast difference between sort of common sense or folk definitions of race and how it's used in critical race theory and in whiteness studies and in other contexts. And what are the contemporary modern folk definitions aren't necessarily things that would have been useful in the antiquity or measures of what we would call race. So I'll go through sort of my definition slides. I'm not going to read them, and I'll actually, if people want them, I can make a link available to them later. And if I can either keep Jackie's on if she's willing to share, or
yeah.
Okay, then we can make a link available to people on the Everyday Orientalism webpage. But definitions 101, it's like if you aren't starting off your class and making sure that everyone is sort of on the same page for how you're using these terms, then it can actually lead to a lot of misunderstandings. And so we find that doing this early really helps nip problems in the bud, though we'll talk about some of the problems and how we deal with them after we go through this. So I work from a definition of race that is derived primarily from two different sources. One is Falguni Schett's Towards a Political Philosophy of Race, and the other is Fields and Fields' book, Racecraft. And so I think of race, we talk about it on the institutional level. So when we talk about race, my primary definition is that it is a technology that is used for managing human populations, basically. So for classifying difference from a defined norm. That is enforced typically through violence or underlying threat of violence. For me, one of the most important things is that race is not something that is very loose, and that if there isn't a sort of system of oppression or some sort of mechanism for enforcing a racial category, then you don't have race, you have ethnicity, you have prejudice, you have ethnocentrism, you have xenophobia, you don't have racism necessarily. That there is this need for these racial categories to actually be enforced in some way. And that enforcement is typically through some threat of violence. So that for me is a fundamental underpinning for whether or not we can talk about race in an ancient context. Here are the slide that I show the students, right? Because most of the students come into class thinking that race equals your skin color, and what some scholars refer to as somatic, which is like a physiological definition, or epidermal. And there are scholars who are doing really great work on what we would think of as recoloring the ancient world, sort of undoing the whitewashing that the ancient world has undergone. But it's very important to recognize that whiteness and blackness are, with capital letters, are not necessarily things that are operable in the ancient world. And I'm very, very careful to differentiate between an investigation or a study of blackness in antiquity, like where are people who we would call black living in antiquity and restoring them to the ancient Mediterranean, or work like Shelley Haley's, where we sort of rethinking color terms, and what I'm calling race in the class, because I want to be very conscientious of, one, not transporting modern identities onto the ancient texts that they aren't necessarily talking about. And also, one of the things Jackie and I will both talk about is the resistance and sort of resisting the pull to reify the idea of biorace as race writ large. And I think Jackie will speak to that as well in her discussion. So the option that I use for my classes is option 2, which is race as technology. And then what we call a racial group in antiquity is a group that is defined within a specific race structure. So it's going to vary by context. You're not going to have one racial group in an Athenian context is not necessarily going to be a racial group in a context in, you know, Halicarnassus, right? Or in Rhodes, or in epic or versus tragedy, you know, the Aeschylus tragedy. Or so as you move contexts, and you move time periods, a Roman context and a Greek context might have very different definitions of race. So racial groups are going to be constructed through the technology of human population management that you find. But again, it's not just saying environmental determinism. Oh, they say people have black skin because they live in this climate and pale skin because they live in this other climate, and that's race. Those are actually just fact statements that they're trying to make from their observations. These are not putting people into a system or a hierarchy that then ranks them and that actually can be enforced, that there are privileges and oppressions that associate with those distinctions. For ethnicity, I sort of use the sort of more contingent group identity shaped according to changing needs and contexts, most frequently reflecting a self-identification with a group based on various cultural, shared cultural ideas. And so there's a rich bibliography on this in the study of antiquity. Jackie and I both like Jonathan Hall's work in this particular area. But the term ethnicity was coined early in the 20th century, circa 1905-ish or so, by Weber, originally in German, as a way for him to talk about cultural considerations that didn't attach to the 19th century concept of biorace. He wanted something that wasn't biological, so you could have imagined kinship groups, but it's not going to be the sort of broad biological category. So using race and ethnicity interchangeably for me is not an option in my classrooms, and using ethnicity or using race as ethnicity is for me not an option in my classroom, because I want to very much distinguish these two types of systems. And what we call race in the modern period is not really something that is going to be operational in the ancient world under my definition system. Then, because a lot of people are looking to Ibram Kendi's work these days, I also had, because I used Stamp from the Beginning as the narrative of US history that I paired with my text, I always give them a slide that defines what he means so that they understand, again, the terms of engagement that we're pulling from our readings. I also give them a functional definition of whiteness, because I want them to understand that whiteness doesn't exist in the ancient world, that though we might run into things that might bump up against whiteness, such as the construction of the Athenian in the Athenian Medic system. And then I finally, and I derive this definition from Alistair Bonnet's work on white identity and his work in critical whiteness studies. And then finally, I make sure, if I'm going to be talking about white supremacism, that my students actually have a working definition of white supremacism that isn't tiki-torchy, tiki torch marching guys in Charlotte, but that they recognize Charlottesville, but that they recognize that white supremacism is actually a system that we all operate in and that has been normalized in our world, and that colorblind ideologies actually are part and parcel of white supremacism. and pushing back on this idea that there are neutral narratives that are white narratives, essentially, and then that there are counter narratives that are not white narratives. That's actually a function of white supremacism. So I make sure that we all are on the same page. When I say white supremacism, they know what I mean by white supremacism, and it's not, you know, the KKK. It's basically any system that we have that deprivileges people of color systematically because they are of color in our contemporary contexts. It can be a banking system, it can be real estate, it can be our textbook industry, it can be the structures at the college that they live in and around. So those are the things that I sort of make sure at the very beginning of the course that we go through and we define. And obviously, if I'm not using Kendi for class, if I'm using other, for the next time I teach the class, I might use Kwame Anthony Apaya's The Lies That Bind, which is going to be a different set of definitions from the definitions of race, of segregationism, assimilationism, and anti-racism. But I always make sure that that's right up front so that there's no questions asked. And if you're not doing that in your class, then you might allow for the reproduction of ideas that you find that are in fact racist ideas, but you're not really planning for it. But I'll talk about how I deal with that when we get to the section on problems that we run into. So Jackie, you're ready to go?
Yeah. Okay, that's okay. Yeah. So I basically have the same, we basically have the same approach. Yeah, I give definitions in the beginning, and these are really, really important. My understanding of race actually dovetails perfectly with Rebecca's, only that, again, the terminology is a little bit different. And so what I come at when I define race is trying to break down the bioracism question right away, which tends to define races in terms of physical difference, and the assumption that somehow physical difference is going to be the producing racism. And so one exercise I tend to do is have a lot of shapes in different colors, and then have people individually group them according to what they think are similarities. And of course, everybody has different groups, and then say, okay, well, just because you notice that there are differences and similarities, this is not race. It's when you want to impose power structures onto these differences and similarities, that's when you move into the direction of race. And so I usually talk about race as emerging out of a desire to oppress, a desire to control, a desire to exploit, enslave, etc., by one group on other groups. And then I borrow this idea of the continuum of okayness from Adolph Reed Jr. In his class notes. It's a really cool idea, and I think it does capture the same essence of this, which is the idea that it's the dominant group that is creating race. And how they do it is in terms of a distinction of difference. So to the extent that another group is so different from us that they're at one end of this spectrum that we have down here. So one end of the spectrum would be the dominant group. The other end of the spectrum is the race, whatever the group is. And everybody in between is what I would call ethnic other. So ethnicity would be self-defining, the way Hall talks about it, using different mythologies, et cetera, narratives, discourse, et cetera, to create self-identity. But ethnic otherness is when this dominant group is creating an ethnic identity about you and producing structures in the society that manage you. So I have this, I think it's really important to connect race to the idea of dehumanization. That's another important aspect. And so I talk about it in terms of alienable, alienated, and inalienable humanity, right? And so in this case, the idea then is the alienable and alienated humanity, people that can have that are not the dominant group. So the dominant group recognizes itself as having inalienable humanity, right? Where it doesn't fully recognize the humanity of the other, ethnic other, or the race. And so in the case of the the race, it's pretty straightforward. They just don't recognize their humanity. Now, in the case of the ethnic other, the ethnic other is always sort of under the sort of Damocles, whereby they can be shunted into the alienated humanity, right? And so this is how this overlaps with how Rebecca thinks about the medics, et cetera, and the use of different technologies to move immigrant groups that are somewhat closer to, or perceived as closer to the dominant group by the dominant group, but then when necessary, move them into the race group. So this, I think it covers this idea of how racialization happens. And so, so that's the really, I think the crux of my idea is this alienated and alienable humanity idea. And then, Rebecca, you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and so then, so it has to do with this idea of the quality of the humanity, that the dominant group, so it's always this tendentious position of the dominant group looking at the others, right? And so from their perspective, atrocities can be committed against these other groups with very little or no consequences whatsoever for the dominant group. So we could just think about the Black Lives Matter's main crux of the argument that's being made there is that, look, Black people are not being treated with the same humanity as white people when it comes to bucking up against the law. So the legal system just doesn't recognize their humanity, and there are no consequences. So this is the idea that is, I think, a sign that you're dealing with race when the laws that protect your humanity are not being recognized for that particular group. So that's the main idea there. And the next slide there. Okay, yeah. And so way I always present it is that race and ethnic otherness is always relational to this dominant group, right? And then how they maintain it is through legal systems, through cultural norms, and in this I'm borrowing from Fields and Fields, as Rebecca also uses their book Racecraft, where they actually talk about the ways in which and they're not the only ones. This is in general how a lot of race theorists think about how race works, is that there are all these structures, institutions in the society that maintain this fiction of a human difference between the two groups. And so whereas in our society that difference is based on skin color and descent from slaves, etc. Whereas in the ancient world, it manifests itself on different grounds. But there are these institutions that will maintain and manifest the absolute human difference between the dominant group and these others that the dominant group wants to exploit or regularly exploits. And so, yeah, so that's generally how I tend to explain the differences. And since I'm more of a literature person, I tend to use literature to show it because there it tends to come out. You actually have a fictionalized version of the society, and then you can see the relationships. And so that's why I'm working on the using epic, because epic is a dominant and an authoritative narrative in the ancient world. And so how uncovering what race looks like in epic, I think, is important for us to, as a sort of baseline understanding of how the society is producing race in the various groups. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So the practice of race is usually about like all these different the ways you can recognize that race is happening, I think, are human atrocities with no consequence, human trafficking, no consequence, enslavement, all these things that are just normalized in the society. And you can see then this means that it's really possible to see race over time now. Like that the racism that we experience in our world is just one particularized manifestation of a general sort of Platonic form of race, right? Where, because the whole history of the world is full of atrocities, human trafficking, and enslavement. And so we then can look at the Greco-Roman world as sort of a way to think, at least this is how my approach is just as a way of thinking ourselves out of this, you know, almost impossible predicament of having race all the time. All right. Okay. So should we move on, or do you want to comment on that?
I would just add one comment, which is that although Jackie and I are using slightly different terminology because we approach from, like, I'm coming from a political and legal structure oftentimes. So because I'm a historian, I spend a lot of time reading laws, but I also am looking at literary texts, but I tend to still bring the same type of definition. So, but you can see that what we're both really saying, I think, that is important. And I want to explain why we're saying this in a sense, is because one of the places where you get a lot of pushback on whether there is race in the ancient world is from modern critical race theorists and from modern historians of the transatlantic slave trade and of, like, the caste system in India and other places, where, because we have crafted over the course of you know, these last 500 years, and then in terms of scientific structures of racism over the last 200 or so years, this very dominant way of viewing this thing called race, that we can't talk about race in the ancient world without, in fact, diminishing the problematics of race in the modern world. And so oftentimes you'll get pushback from modern scholars of race if you're not really super careful and demonstrate that you actually know what race is in the modern constructs. So I think also a place to look, if you are looking for other ways and places that race in the ancient world that is similar to both what Jackie and I do, Geraldine Heng's book on the invention of race in the medieval world, which actually goes through a whole bunch of different geographic places. It's a very dense book, but she really functions from a similar perspective about how you can because when we talk about biorace, we're talking about these really sort of broad continental or, you know, physiological things that are primordial and sort of you can't get out of, they're inherent, and they link the sort of deep past to modern manifestation, the deep past to character, right? And so we just want to be very careful that you have a very clear definition and that you are educating yourself on what modern race scholarship is doing outside of classics, because sometimes the way that we in classics and in antiquity studies generally, I see it in early Christian studies as well, we just throw the word race around as if we know what it means because we're using what people on the street would mean. And I guess we can sort of segue that into some of the problems that we encounter in the classroom. And the biggest problem I encounter is, in fact, that the students don't know what race, well, they don't know, they think they know what race is, but they don't. You ask them to define it and they can't. And none of them have ever heard of ethnicity, right? And because it's more of a technical term. And they might have heard of the term the other or othering if they took an anthropology course or some other certain courses, but maybe not. And so Jackie mentioned an exercise that she does, which is with the shapes and colors. I do two exercises. The first one is typically on the first day of class, the day I go over all the syllabi and material and things. I actually meet students in my university's museum, and I have a selection of 8 objects that are from vastly different time periods and geographic regions. So they go from ancient China, they go from ancient Egypt to ancient China to modern indigenous pottery. I just picked pots. They're all pots. And they're all different shapes and they're different designs. And I set them out on a table and I give the students a blank sheet of paper and I say for each object, go up to the object and I want you to tell me what geographic region you think it comes from, what time period you think it was produced, and why you have made this decision. And inevitably, the ugliest thing on the table, which is actually a hand mold lantern, oil lamp from Roman Palestine, is the thing that they mark as modern indigenous pottery. And the most beautiful thing on the table, which is the work of a modern indigenous artist, they mark as like ancient Greek, like geometric or Egyptian or something. And so I do this as a way to get them to think about what biases they are bringing to the table and to start thinking about how prejudice can act, racism without racists, or like sort of prejudice without a race system, but we're in a race system, so then we have to break that down. The second exercise that I have them do is actually preparation for a later project where they have to make a podcast as a group, where they explain an ancient approach, an ancient theory of race and ethnicity to a general audience. But I have them do something called a vox pop, which is they go out to the campus area and they do short interviews with just random classmates on asking their classmates to tell them what is race and what is ethnicity. And then they have to splice this together in a 4 to 5 minute mini podcast about what people on the street think these things are. And then they have to sort of summarize it and then compare it to the definitions that we're using in class. And one of the things that they realized very quickly is that none of them, they all use this word race, but they really actually haven't thought it through. Mostly the white students, of course. Other students will have a different experience of race, but their classmates typically are very much, it's all skin color, skin color, skin color. And that, you know, actually is a way, I think Fields would call that sort of race craft, right? That's how racism becomes race, as opposed to the actual reality of the raced system that we live in. So I have them do this exercise as a way to try then to get them to then come to terms with their own understanding of the world and how that understanding of the world actually obscures the systematic oppressions that actually go on and are set into our institutions. And that then frees us up to have this conversation about, well, what is race and can it be a transhistorical phenomenon and how do we know? Mm-hmm. And as you might suspect from my approach to this, I actually talk at a very limited way about race and antiquity. When we do talk about it in class, it's like, okay, so we're in a specific context or a specific text where we can actually see that playing out. So Jackie is doing the example of epic with hers because it's an authoritative narrative that creates these constructions. I, of course, talk about the Athenian Medic system, but I also might talk about Sparta and the Helots, right? Or sort of other comparable situations. But I won't be talking about Greeks and Scythians as the Scythians as a race, or anytime. I don't even like to say Greeks because Greeks didn't think of themselves primarily as, they didn't think about themselves as Greeks, thought about themselves as Hellenes, but then they also thought about themselves in very different ways. So my goal in my class typically is, how can I get the students to understand the ancient ways that they constructed their own identities, and then how did those play out as they got adapted and adopted in the modern world? And so facing this problem of biorace to me is one of the most fundamentally important class problems that you can face. And then following up on that is, how do you not then reproduce racist structures within your classroom when you're trying to move, like, how can redefining race in a way that is more aligned with critical race structures help us to then make sure that in our own classroom we're not enacting race structures as we have these conversations. But I'm going to leave that because I think that moves into the next segment. I'm just going to let Jackie talk about how she approaches problems like biorace and others in class.
Yeah, so well, this might lead to our
yeah, we can. I think at this point, like in terms of, we should just talk about whatever at this point until we get to the Katerine tells us we have to shut up.
Yeah, no. So since my approach is not historical, it tends to be, as I said, literary. So one of the things that, as I said, one of my projects in teaching race is to deconstruct or destroy this idea that the classical world, quote unquote, Greco-Roman world, is a white past, right? And so that means, of course, looking at sort of covering Blackness or rediscovering Blackness in the ancient world. That's one element of it. People are always shocked when I point out, hey, this is Black. Right. That usually drives people nuts. You know, or you know, really these problematic texts, thinking about, hey, why are, so for example, I'll talk about Herodotus's discussion of the Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Colchians, because, right, and throw that on the table, look at the commentaries on that, and talk about why is there this apprehension by modern scholars to actually just translate things literally?
Gotta have the euphemisms, right?
Yeah, and how that apprehension tends to lead to racist translations, right? So that's one aspect of my approach is that. But then also thinking about what is it about the appropriation of classics in, or I guess since the construction of Black racism, anti-Black racism, what is it about this appropriation of classics that makes everyone think, whether Black or white, everyone think that classics is for whites only? And this, why they're like, a handful of Black scholars. Why are most of the Black scholars actually not African American, right? What is going on? Why is a classic so repellent to African Americans, or why is it repelling African Americans and other people of color, particularly Black people of color, from it, when in fact it's not, right? And so that's another aspect, is to one exercise I used to have early on, before it was like ubiquitous, and before dawn of Zuckerberg's book, was to have the students, okay, now go on the internet, just like, sorry, I'm going to let you go on the internet. I want you to find how white supremacist groups are using classics. Just go. And then come back and report. And they usually find all these like alt-right, well, I guess they wouldn't have been alt-right back then, but they definitely racist sites. And they were just amazed at how, not just that they were quoting Herodotus or whatever, but that they were actually quoting scholars, like actual classical scholars, like actual classicists.
Yeah, when you see that people, like a website like Occidental Review, right, is like just like it's just like reproducing stuff written by Donald Kagan.
Yeah, that's scary.
Right. It gives a validity to this certain narrative.
Right.
Just in terms of what you were saying really quickly, I wanted to throw out another book recommendation.
Go ahead.
Cord Whitaker's book, Black Metaphors.
Yes,
in the medieval world, which might be really useful for people also thinking about restoring Blackness. And color back into our ancient texts and how we translate them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so that exercise often is a shocker, or back then. Now I just have them read Donna's chapter out of Donna's book to solve that. That way they don't have to go through the trauma of actually finding out all this stuff on the internet. But the point is that, that it has classics. And then, of course, we look at the speeches by pro-slavery politicians, and poetry that's pro-slavery that does incorporate classics. One is was it the Voyage of the Sable Venus, not the recent one that's by a Black woman poet, but the ancient one, the old one from the 1760s, 1790, and the image that went with it, which was basically a Botticelli redo, where the Venus is black, but it's very exoticizing, and the whole point of this poem is to justify raping slave women to produce Creole or mixed race slaves. So to show that, look, from the beginnings of the creation of Black-white racism, classics has been used or deployed as a tool, as Rebecca's talking about, like these tools and technologies of race. Classical themes, etc., has been used. So to try to point out that this is not neutral, right? And that the idea that there is a neutral narrative about classics, that you can come to classics and not have any need to worry about race, that there's some sort of race neutral reading of any engagement with Black skin in the in ancient texts, or Africa in ancient texts, is really actually buying into this colorblind racism and white supremacist thinking, right? So that's one of the things that we encounter quickly in my approach. Yeah, so that would be one of the exercises I do that sort of reinforces this the main goal of my thing.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why I changed the structure of my class to move from the first 10 weeks is ancient, and then last 5 weeks is reception, 4 or 5 weeks is reception, and instead I interweave it all the way through. And it's why I spend the first week really sort of trying to deconstruct or deconstruct this idea of white narrative of the ancient world. It's one of the reasons why I moved to pairing Kennedy, because he sort of hits at the very early on the existence of the use of classics in environmental discussions of the ancient world, and also in the construction of in the slave apologism. And so I think that's so I think it's really important for us to get to that really super early on in your class. And actually, I think it's very important, and I want to point this out because I think as people in the classroom, one of the things that Jackie and I, as if you've noticed, we both tend to be very invested in and conversant in different, potentially in different texts, but we attempt to be very conversant in critical race theory and also in critical race pedagogy, in part because you have to be really super careful when you're having these conversations that you aren't putting your students on the spot to talk about things that they may not be comfortable talking about, because you're doing this conversation on like day 2 or day 1 in class. Exactly. And I just want to put something out there, very a caution that I would put as a white faculty member in the classroom is I never, ever expect any of my students in my classroom to bring their personal experiences into these discussions. That is their personal experience. Right. They may read the text differently. And I have to be conscientious of the fact that because I am, as part of my regular narrative, acknowledging the whitewashing of the ancient world and trying to work to restore people to the ancient world who are Black, Black indigenous populations to the ancient world, I'm still never going to ask my students to address that issue. And I'm certainly not going to stare them in the eyeball while I'm saying there are Black people in the world, as if I need to make sure I get the acknowledgement of the only Black student in my classroom. You just have to be really careful that you are not going in there ignorant of your own positionality and of the importance and having a knowledge and a strong base in critical race. And I do not specialize in Blackness. And I don't, many of the scholars I read obviously are scholars who are Black scholars, but it's also very important to read critical whiteness studies and to understand how whiteness is constructed, and to make sure that you are hitting those buttons in the classroom to deconstruct whiteness, not just because we want to make sure they don't continue to port that whiteness into the ancient world, but that we are very cognizant of how whiteness uses classics. So all these things that Jackie has said, I just wanted to sort of, if you need some suggestions on critical whiteness studies, Alistair Bonet has been doing this work since the 90s. It's not a new field, and there's actually a really great book, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I'll give it to Katerine, that is Black Scholars on Whiteness. An edited volume of Black Scholars of critical race theories on whiteness. But that's going to can help you also. It's not just to help you teach race and ethnicity in the ancient world, it's to help you understand your classroom dynamics. Because it's not about, do I have students of color in my classroom and how can I use them to make this better? Their experiences should not be put on the spot in any way. Right. If they want to bring those experiences in the class, that's up to them. You should never put that on them.
Yeah, and in my class, usually in the one that's from the ancient emancipation one, whiteness is like the first unit because we have to construct it. And I think the one thing I've said this before at like a CAS presentation too, that one thing that you might consider is teaming up with someone in race studies or African American studies and team teaching a course, because not only will that sort of, because you'll be working with someone, it'll get you more conversant with things, but also it's a way of sort of proselytizing or classics, or debunking the idea that classics is for whites only. If you are gonna reach out to the African American studies or Africana studies programs, right? I have the advantage of being in both departments, and of course being a person of color, it's easier on that. But I do think that part of the issue is that there was a culture war in the 80s that actually created a wall between classics and Africana studies, and that wall needs to be taken down if we want to actually move forward in classics.
Yeah, and I would just add one other thing. I'm actually probably going to be co-teaching a class next year on race, ancient and modern, with a colleague in anthropology who is not Black. He's Indian, but he's actually had a bunch of experiences working in European archaeology as an Indian man. But he teaches race and ethnicity, and he does semiotics. And so we're going to again be bringing these very different approaches, but showing how they communicate together. And I have been doing a lot of collaborations on campus, not necessarily co-teaching my class, because our mechanisms for co-teaching they're very highly structured, but of bringing scholars to campus. So I brought Jackie and Patrice Rankin and Brandon Bourgeois and Caroline to campus last year with my colleague in communication, who is a Du Bois scholar. There are lots of ways that you can engage around campus with your colleagues. It doesn't have to be co-teaching a course. It can be organizing speakers who come in conjunction with both of your classes. It can be organizing events, like the same colleague, Omedi Ocheng, and I, we're doing the AOS Reads thing together on campus in September. So there are lots of ways that you can help to connect what you're doing in your classroom to other programs and departments that can help you become a better teacher of this material.
Yeah.
So I am back. Ladies, were you done with
yeah, I'm actually done. I'm going to close my window because we just have a thunderstorm starting, and I'm just like waiting for
Go ahead. Jackie, did you want to add something in conclusion?
Well, we didn't actually talk. Well, I guess Rebecca talked about being a white person teaching. I haven't really talked about being a Black person teaching.
Go ahead. That's
yeah. So what's interesting is the amount of credibility that I'm granted as a Black person teaching race. Not that I don't deserve it, but compared to when I'm teaching Hellenistic poetry, say, right? And this is a major part of the problem, right? Is that there aren't enough Black scholars in classics, and all of us are certainly hired with the expectation that you're going to teach race, and okay, we do, but then, if your area is something else, say Roman history or Hellenistic poetry, the students, if not your colleagues as well, but the students for sure, seem to think you're less credible in your actual area of expertise. And so again, educating the students into the idea that, look, okay, classics isn't just for white people. And the reason why there are no or very few Black people in classics, and I'm singling out Black people, because there are people of color that are in classics, but the minority situation in terms of Black people is even smaller, and that has a lot to do with the role that classics plays in anti-Black racism, right? So the fact that there are no Black students in your class has a lot to do with the perception of classics as racist, and you want to break that down. But also then the students in the class get the impression that they've never had a Black teacher teaching them Greek, say, or Latin. And this reinforces their ideas as well. So they don't grant as much credibility to a person of color in the classics class, but they will grant a lot of credibility in the race and ethnicity class. And I've often found that very jarring in the same semester, where it's like I'm teaching Hellenistic poetry and these students are just being outrageous, and then I'm teaching the same semester, I'm teaching a race class, and the students are like, oh wow, you know. So it's very jarring, and so this then leads to this sense of tokenism, because it's like, well, you really, I was told at one point, you weren't hired to teach you weren't hired as the Hellenist, you were hired to teach race. I was like, oh, I thought the ad said Hellenist, right? So had I known it was only to teach race, I would not have applied, right? So this is another thing that goes on, where I hesitate to do this, but because you always get complaints about it. But it's just like back in the day when women finally were being brought into classics, and women were required, and I think expected
to me, right?
teach gender, right? And so it's the same as if their scholarship on something else, or even on gender studies, isn't real scholarship, right? So this is still a thing right now, I think, with race and ethnicity studies, that Black scholars are hired with the expectation that their expertise, which they do probably have, but nonetheless, that their central point of expertise is race, and that's what we're going to give all credit to. And you know, they could have changed the world as far as Greek history is concerned. That's not as important, and that, I think, is a tendency to lead in toward it is tokenism to a large extent, where it's just, we just want to have this windows dressing person who is going to teach race, and then they never actually demonstrate their expertise as a classicist. So this is also why I'm interested in Du Bois as well, because the construction of him as a classicist or not is I think bound up in this idea of whether classics is for whites only.
Yeah, and I think that actually you might start to see a proliferation of job ads
yeah.
that say, we want someone who can teach race and ethnicity. And because hiring committees are predominantly white, right, because most classics departments don't have anyone who's a person of color, let alone someone who's Black, that they'll say, this is how we're going to diversify our faculty. We're going to advertise a job for someone who is a teacher of race and ethnicity or a scholar of race and ethnicity. And just to sort of, the expectation is, well, now I can hire that, that Black scholar. And then this also leads to a perpetuation problem that race is not a white person's issue.
Right.
That white people shouldn't be involved in the study of race. That anytime I go out and speak on the issue of race and antiquity, I'm shutting up or I'm shutting down someone of color who should be the person talking about it.
Right.
When I'm not talking about modern constructions of these things, I'm talking about ancient, and whiteness is a problem, and whiteness is something that needs to be done. I think there's a difference of perspective that's going to be done.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for these last remarks. I'm glad we had time to discuss all these points with you, and there's been a few questions already in the chat. So if you allow me, we'll move on to the Q&A. So there's a first question which pertains to the particular pandemic context we're in. So that person wants to know, how do COVID-related restrictions on in your respective campuses will affect your teaching of race-related topics, and how you intend to deal with these challenges?
So I'm teaching a class this semester. So I actually was teaching my race and ethnicity course, my ancient identities course, last spring when we emergency went online. And I'm teaching an intro survey to the ancient Mediterranean this semester that centers and fronts deconstructing white narratives of Africa and Asia as part of not being part of the Mediterranean world. And I'm sort of having the students read histories of Africa and histories of ancient world that are by non-white scholars. and particularly by maybe Africologists, instead of having them be read, the Oxford Don writing on Egypt, etc. And my one concern that I said to the students was, I'm recording these things because we have to let students who have to be asynchronous participate in the class. But, I do worry because of the sort of broader work that some of us do, and because of some of these groups that are out there who are policing how we talk about race and ethnicity in the ancient world, that these recordings might go online somewhere and be used to harm either us or our students. I mean, I can take it, but I don't want any of my students to be thrown in harm's way. And the recordings record student comments and discussion as well as my own comments. So that's my biggest concern. And so really I'm really having to sort of emphasize to my students that it's just not appropriate to share recordings. But otherwise, it hasn't changed how I teach. I just have to be more conscientious of the fact that the technology could lead to external forces who want to cause harm to my students or myself or my institution. So that's my primary issue.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be teaching in the spring. I'm not teaching this semester, so I'm just reading all the complaints of everybody teaching right now, and sort of trying to come up with my own, like, okay, how am I going to buffer this situation? But I've already decided that I was going to teach online, partly because I am going to be doing this joint cross universe course, part of it with Anya Bettenfort in Cologne. So we're going to have sessions that are joint with her class and my class. So definitely needs to be online for that. So I'm going to be doing it online. Yeah, and I am concerned about the recordings. But again, other than warning them, please don't share this. Use it for your own benefit. There's not really much we can do there in that respect. So but I've only been I like to learn from other people's mistakes. So since I have the whole semester to like see what my colleagues are complaining about and marking that down, is like, okay, all right, there's a workaround for that. Once they've solved all these problems, by the time I get to do it, it'll be fine. It'll be all good.
Yeah, I do want to address one of the questions that has popped up in the chat in relationship to this, because it's about the use of visuals. And when you go online, you often tend to use more
sure.
PowerPoints and things like this. Yeah, so Sherry's question. And actually, so I do, in terms of, like I said, I don't expect any students to bring their lived experiences into the classroom, especially if we're in a Zoom session that's being recorded. Like, I definitely don't want students to feel like they have to, but they are allowed, obviously. And the assignments that I do that are only read by me tend to be assignments done by on reflection and other things. But you specifically brought up the issue of the Janus issue. I've been doing some research into trying to figure out when Janiform images of Janiforms or evidence of Janiforms and Nilotic scenes became known in the US, because I'm pretty convinced that both blackface and minstrel show images, as well as gator bait images, are actually receptions of those ancient texts. And so I think that while they may not have been racist in the ancient context, I think that they actually have racist receptions. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's super important for us as teachers to be very conscientious that when you look at a Janiform, it's not just that she's ugly, as the student might have said, but that the image is actually very reminiscent and reflective of, if you look at the African American History Museum, they have a whole collection of blackface toys and sort of popular things. It's a replication of those images.
Right.
And so
the issue is more of a question of how conditioned the student who thinks this is an ugly image is by the cultural appropriation of those forms, right? So that's that response. You could say, okay, you may think that, but here's probably why you think that. and then show the cultural appropriation with some care, right? That these images are offensive, but at the same point, it's like, so there's a perfect example of how a classical image that really doesn't have any racial connotations is then racialized and becomes part of the apparatus of race, our constructions of race, which have, and beauty standards are number one on the list of like what constructs race, how race is constructed, right? So how beauty is received or perceived. This is what that. So Sherry, you could think about it, approaching it in that respect, and how their response is actually proof of the production of anti-Black racism. Yeah.
So that's
exactly what I would say.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to be constantly vigilant and aware of and ready and conversant in ancient and modern. And I would recommend another book here that might be helpful to you, which is Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Stony the Road.
Yeah.
Actually, it's got a lot of visual images, but he actually talks about the way that this specific iconography of the minstrel show and blackface and negative representations of African Americans came into being in the post-Reconstruction era that he refers to as redemption, and how that sort of solidified this type of image and burned it into the imagination. The American imagination through like complete and like prolific and repetitive use in popular iconography. It's got lots of images in it, and it tells you how to get to some more and talks about that period, and that can help you understand the historical contingency of those images in a way that you can then communicate with your students. But I'd also just really, obviously, I would just say, I think it's really bad form to continually use those Janiform images as our representation of race in the ancient world.
Right. Yeah.
And so just be really serious about how you're using them and be conscientious and actually already be prepared to have that conversation before you put that image up there.
Right, yeah.
So there's been a few questions in the chat asking to clarify this relationship between modern constructions of race and whether there is race and antiquity and how different that would be. So I'll read one question. For instance, my impression has been that our concept of modern race was socially constructed during the transatlantic slave trade. Would you say this is accurate? And could you give a sense of how race was constructed in the Greco-Roman world?
Yeah. You want me to jump in first, and then you can come in?
Yeah, you can go in first, and then I'll just bring in some specific examples of where I see race in the ancient world.
Yeah. So in general, race is socially constructed. Okay. Now, in the transatlantic slave trade, a specific form of race, anti-Black racism, was constructed, and that's the dominant form of racism that we live in under. Like this is the unit. But that doesn't mean that race came into existence whole cloth or out of Zeus's head at that time, that there was no race before that, or that race was socially constructed in other ways in other times. And one of the ways into this is to think about in Canada, say, racism is constructed quite differently than in America, partly because there were slaves in Canada. However, there wasn't a large population of slaves, and moreover, the British abolished slavery well before the Americans did, and there was antagonism between the British and the Americans about the abolition of slavery. So the way in which Canadians construct race is not entirely anti-Black. It tends to be anti-dark-skinned people in general. So people from Pakistan, people from India will all fall under this umbrella of racism, white supremacist racism. So that one manifestation is particularly this way, whereas in America you have multiple, another set of racial dynamics that have historically legal consequences that are still being felt in terms of Jim Crow, segregation, all these kinds of things that were targeting specifically African-American descendants of slaves, so that they would be marginalized and suppressed even after emancipation. So that's not a function of the legal system in Canada. So racism manifests itself differently. Just so this is within just the same time zone that we're talking about. We have two different, and then if you went to England, it would be another animal there.
And I would say also, if you go to India,
yeah,
they
another
have
animal
tradition
there.
Of the transatlantic slave trade, but they have racism and race.
Yeah, exactly.
Go to China, and China has its own history that has nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade, but they have
with
race.
skin color, for that matter, right? So so we can just think about it. Even within the system that we're operating with, there are different manifestations. Now, if you get outside of that system, what I try to talk about is what are we looking for that tells us we're dealing with race, right? And that's the what I'm calling the alienated humanity, right? Where there's a group of people that are identified by the dominant group as less than human. And that means that we can enslave them, we can rape them, we can kill them without consequence, right? We can make them live under, lower economic conditions. We deny them rights, we can do anything that we need to do to exploit them. And we then construct laws that regulate them. And we also construct myths about why they're different. They have different blood than us. Even where they don't look different from us, they've got different blood, right? And which is, of course, fantasy ideas. And so in the case of where what was fortuitous, one might say, for the folks who wanted to construct white supremacy was that, Africans have different skin color. We can use that as a thing of distinguishing them from us, and that's what makes them different. And then you get these myths about the beauty standards, all these different things start to pile up, laws, etc. Why they need to be enslaved, why they're natural slaves. They're trying to actually give some actual group to Aristotle's natural slaves, right? And so it's that. So you definitely can have and do have racism operating in the ancient world, just as you have it operating in other places where the transatlantic slave trade was not part of the system. So it is possible, but it is peculiar here. And so we were talking about that. Yeah, there's pushback on that because people don't want to, or feel that maybe the issue of racism today might get diminished in the face of the fact that, well, racism is a human condition, right? But I think that that's not, if it's handled properly, I don't think that that's the case. I think it's recognizing that this is a system that is a problem with humanity, and that we need to work on it, right?
Yeah,
so,
would you have an example?
Yeah,
So Rebecca, you give some examples for.
Yeah, so I would start with so if you go back to the definitions, which Nandini relinked to everyone further down in the chat line, the way that both of us are thinking about race is we're actually drawing our conceptions of race as system from scholars who work on Blackness in America and anti-Blackness, but also who work on the caste system in India, who work on other manifestations of race. So a specific example that I work on in the ancient world is, of course, the Athenian Medic. And I don't say the Athenian here, but I say the Medic. The Medic is a racialized category. They are a race within Athens. They are a legally constructed, subhuman, alienated group that is constructed through the legal structures and social structures that allow them to be basically an in-between state between free and enslaved, but who can be sent into enslavement at any time for violation of their legal structures. The way that race is essentially constructed is that within a context, the dominant group will sort of identify something that Sheth refers to as the unruly, right? This idea that there's a group within your group that has something wrong with it. And oftentimes you can't tell that there's something wrong with it. They don't look different. So the medics, in the case of the Athenians, they're mostly other Greeks, or they might be from West Asia. Visually, they don't look differently. Cultural practice, they may not in fact have different cultural practices, but there's something about them that bothers the Athenians. And so they codify them into law as a different group. Mm-hmm. Prejudices abound then to justify this codification. So then you actually have starting more restrictions like the Athenian citizenship law, restrictions on land ownership, on property inheritance, restrictions on intermarriage that pile up over time as a way to justify. And then you actually have, after the development of the Medic, the development of the idea of the autochthonous Athenian who is bound to their land through indigenous descent that you then have to protect. Mm-hmm. So that you have this sort of process by which a group becomes racialized, and the threat that holds that group together, the only thing that defines them all as a group is that they're all subject in law to enslavement, essentially, whereas a free Athenian is not. Mm-hmm. So that's like one very specific example. And I actually have an article that's coming out in a volume on identity and antiquity, hopefully within the next 6 months to a year, that actually sort of breaks down and gives a very detailed way that I see that happening. So if it seems a little that I'm defining it right now, sort of shorthanded, but I think it's important for us to remember that part of our job is to not, I tend to have a US focus on my receptions because I work on scientific racism at the Smithsonian Institute and other places, and in the history of anthropology and eugenics. But the US isn't the only group in the world, and race is not defined only through our experience of it. And we will have students in our classroom who are international students who will not have that same mm-hmm. perspective, but may in fact have knowledge of race and racism in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jackie, did you want to add something, or do you?
No, her example, it works pretty well, and I have a little bit of an advantage on that because I'm Canadian. So I always point out I'm Canadian, so I have a different. So I can always say, well, in Canada it's actually different. So yeah, but making sure that everyone's aware that cult is So I think the focus on it, you can get myopic if we only think about racism in terms of
and I will also add that I emphasize, because I work on the Smithsonian Institute mm-hmm. and the construction of 19th century scientific racism in America, indigenous erasure and genocide is actually a big focus of my work in that sense. And so we use a lot of Kim Tallbear and sort of other indigenous scholars to actually talk about the problem of indigeneity. It's not just about the slave trade and the enslavement of Black Africans in America. We have this entire indigenous population that has been erased in our discussions of race, and who actually had entire government apparatuses structured around their genocide and their erasure and displacement. So, and I think for the Canadian example is actually more apropos to the issues of indigeneity. But then, of course, with the Athenians, we have this reverse image where the indigenous group is the dominant group, and how does that actually, we have to deal with that.
I guess these hegemonic forces should also be taken into account. For instance, Rachel mentioned in the chat how even though in her classes in the UK context she's talking about the British context, mm-hmm. she finds now that the American conception of race is having an influence on how her students understand race. So there are also these hegemonic forces, depending on the time, right?
If you watch enough TikTok, you're gonna get, right? My kids my 15-year-old watches TikTok all the time. She gets a lot of her knowledge of colonialism and imperialism and the Black experience of America and racism, etc., from TikTok.
So there you go.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to another question. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna merge two questions together. So there was a very important question about how you instill an environment of trust in your classroom when you approach these topics. And I'd like to merge it with Sarate's question, which is, I encounter a dynamic with my undergrads where I think white students in particular are afraid of being perceived as racist and participate in class discussions primarily by agreeing with whatever I'm saying and not raising questions or points of confusion. I'm glad they're not coming to this from the opposite end here, but I think this is getting in the way of engaging appropriately with the topic. Have either of you encountered this, and do you have suggestions for this?
Do you want to go first, Jackie, or let me?
Well, I don't think I've encountered that. I try to say in the beginning that I have a thing in the syllabus about being respectful and how you're talking to each other, etc. And but also saying that, you know, we're all learning here, and that we have to recognize that we've all been conditioned to think in certain ways, and you know, you might make a mistake and say something that might offend someone, so we'll try to handle that. But in general, let's be free to say what you want to say. So I sort of give permission in that, and I've had pretty good discussions where we were talking about slavery, and one student, she was white, and she was mentioning, we're talking about Phil Sweetley, and one student was mentioning, but when we're talking about, well, why would she not want to go back to her family, like the slave owning family, and instead grow up, or, you know, pass the rest of her life in poverty, that kind of thing, right? And so one person was saying, was mentioning that, well, why did she go back, actually, in the first part? Yeah, well, maybe she missed them or something like that, and thought, and then of course some people were like, what? But I was saying, well, we got to think about it in terms of, you know, it's a family, right? And, you know, the idea that, well, these slaves are somehow part of the family, and yeah, so maybe they do miss the comforts of the people they know, but it's still slavery, and it's still so there's a way of like acknowledging that sort of interesting perspective that may come from a, you know, lack of understanding of racial oppression, etc. But then you know, acknowledge it, and, you know, and then try to move it forward. It does take a little bit of finessing, but I don't think you should shut someone down if they, you know, unintentionally blurt out something that from everybody else's perspective seems quite racist. I think you should, like, especially if it's unintentional, which it usually is, I think. And so you could say, well, there is a way of looking at this that's not as not as comfortable, and blah blah blah, and try to lead them into that discussion. So yeah, but it is hard because of the pressure on people not to say anything or be worried about saying something that's racist, right? That is hard. But I think, yeah, it does take a little bit of work to try to make everybody feel comfortable with that. What do you do, Rebecca?
So I'll give 3 examples, because one is about their comfort level with me. One is about the way to engage with white students who might be uncomfortable, and the other is how, when you have Black students or other students of color in your classroom, who are in a minority situation in the classroom, who might feel uncomfortable. So the first one is me. I actually have a statement in my syllabus that says, so I have an ethical stance that I take in my syllabi, as my entire campus is now aware of, because I've gone through review with it, that I don't administer, or I don't encourage the administering of student teaching evaluations. And so my statement on my syllabus simply says, I don't encourage this because this is what happens to my untenured colleagues, particularly colleagues of women of color colleagues on campus, particularly Black colleagues of color. Here's a list to like 90 studies that demonstrate this. And then I say in that thing, you know, if you have a problem, I don't say if you have a problem with you, I say if I have said something in class, if I say something in class that is offensive to you, that is troubling to you, or is an issue, please either reach out to me and let me know, and I will try to correct it, or report me to the provost's office. And I've had both experiences. One was a student of color who was upset that I had mentioned something to her roommate that she thought crossed a professional line. And so I apologize. She's totally right. So I apologize to her. And that actually builds a trust that I actually acknowledged my mistake, and I let the students tell me when they think it is. The other student was a white student who was unhappy that I was honest about what it's like to go into grad school in the field. And I couldn't apologize for that. And the provost was like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with what you said. But this allows students to feel like they actually can talk to me, at least. And part of that as well is I make assignments that allow for student reflection that only I see.
Right.
So they're not having to out themselves in the classroom. And they have the ability to decide how open they want to be in those reflections. I don't grade them on bearing their soul. I grade them on telling me, responding to a question. Another thing is sort of dealing with white students who might feel like they don't want to be called racist. One of the times I was teaching a class on classics and white supremacism and in architecture and art. And that was the day that we started class the day after Silent Sam was pulled down at UNC. And so we actually started the first day of class reading about Silent Sam and talking about Confederate monuments. And I had a student who comes from a town that has Confederate monuments in it. And he asked, well, how do I know if it's a racist monument? And instead of saying, what everyone was thinking is like, well, they're all racist monuments. I actually stopped and said, okay, well, let's talk about this and why do people think they're racist and how do we decide whether it is? And we went through a process of like, when was this put up? What is the person wearing? Are they really being acknowledged as establishing a park, or are they in their Confederate uniform? Was it put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy? But that process of actually going through and showing how we can logic through and actually think about and talk about whether something does or does not, is or is not racist in its intent. And then we can talk about whether or not the impact is racist, whether the intent is racist or not, actually was useful to that student. And he remembered it 14 weeks later when he was writing his reflection. And he actually said, I really felt that helped me feel comfortable in this class. Same classroom, and in my race ethnicity classes, I often will have a white student who will say something like, why is it okay to be proud to be Black, but not okay to be proud to be white? And the key to that one is never ask any of your students of color to handle that question.
Right.
You have to be ready to answer that question, and you have to state it. And my typical approach is I explain power and how power works and how it's worked historically in our country. And then I say, if you would like to talk about this further, please come to my office hours and I'm happy to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've had the students who are in that class who are Black students or of color, they've actually thanked me for doing that and said and told me that they've had faculty who don't. They ask them to answer the question. And I'm like, that's appalling, of course. But so I know that it actually has had a good positive impact on the trust that those students have for me. And also the white students who I've said that to have come to my office to talk to me. And we've had that conversation. And so I feel like it was a win-win because I wasn't making my students do it.
Right.
Do those things build trust immediately? No. And I think the expectation that you are going into that room and your students are going to trust you because you're a white woman teaching race and ethnicity, just put that thing away.
Yeah.
You have to do the work to get that trust, and it's going to be a building over time. And it may not be until that final week that that your students of color especially feel, and your white students who might feel alienated by your politics or something, that they might feel like they can trust you. So don't expect it to happen. Work at it and continually work at it. Take criticism from your students, be open to those criticisms, and then maybe you'll get it that semester, and it may just be that they take another class with you later, and that's when you get their trust.
Mm-hmm.
This is all about the work. So I think this is gonna conclude our discussion. I'm aware that some people's questions haven't been answered. I am actually saving the discussion, so I'll pass on all your questions to Rebecca and Jackie. I'm also aware some people are watching us from Facebook and also asking questions, so I'm aware of your questions as well. Thank you everyone for joining us, and a huge thank you to Jackie and Rebecca for your wisdom, your knowledge, your insights, and your kindness and generosity.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Jackie. Yay.
Thank you.
Yay. Okay, so everyone, nice day, evening, week, and back to school period among COVID.
Yeah, COVID teaching tomorrow for me.
Okay, bye everyone.
All right, bye everyone.
Thank you.